Hello, and welcome to your lecture on Alexander the Great Conquers the World. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. Athens had fallen. Sparta was in control. But to the north, a new power was growing. Between the years 359 and 336 BC, Philip II of Macedon, also known as Macedonia, modernized his country and united all of Greece under himself. Located in northern Greece, Macedonia was a weak, backwards country, mostly famous for her timber and for her pasture land. To be frank, the other Greeks considered the Macedonians barbarians. From these humble beginnings came Philip II, who was anything but humble. He had a taste for empire, and his time spent as a hostage in southern Greece had taught him how to achieve it. King Philip II enlarged and modernized the army with siege weapons, sarissas, those are those 18 to 20 foot long pikes you see in the picture, and uniforms to give his army the sense of being part of a team. A formidable team it was, too. Between the years 358 and 338 BC, Philip II conquered Greece piece by piece. Athens and Sparta were too weakened by the Peloponnesian Wars and the disagreements that occurred afterward to fight back effectively. Eventually, all the Greek city-states were united under King Philip II in a group called the Corinthian League. Like the Delian League before it, league was really just a nice way of saying empire. In the year 336 BC, Philip II was assassinated, and his son Alexander, who would later be known as Alexander the Great, ascended the throne. As a child, Alexander had been educated by the great Greek philosopher Aristotle, and he carried those lessons with him for the rest of his life. Literally carried in some cases. He loved the Iliad and the Odyssey so much that he carried them with him on his military campaigns. His hero was Achilles. Alexander's love of literature was more than matched by his natural intelligence and talent for strategy, which made themselves known at an early age. One of the most famous stories from his youth is the taming of Bucephalus. When Alexander was only 12 years old, he managed to tame an untamable horse named Bucephalus because he realized that the reason why Bucephalus was acting so wild was because he was afraid of his own shadow. So Alexander turned Bucephalus toward the sun, and when Bucephalus was facing the sun and so could no longer see his own shadow, he became calm, and Alexander was able to mount and ride him to the court's astonishment. Bucephalus became Alexander's trusty steed. The two of them were so close that when Bucephalus was killed in India, Alexander named a city after him. Bucephalus might have loved Alexander the Great, but not everyone did. His strong personality won him friends and enemies both. In other words, he was one of those people that you either loved or hated. Alexander was generous and merciful. He remembered and rewarded his friends, and he often showed mercy to conquered enemies. But his violent temper and the fact that he hated it when anyone disagreed with him led him to commit atrocities and to kill some of his closest friends. For the most part, his soldiers did love him. After all, he fought on the front lines. In fact, he lived through so many injuries, there was a rumor he was invincible. And he lived with his soldiers, sharing their living conditions and their hardships. Supported by his soldiers and directed by the strength of his strategy, Alexander the Great's army was unstoppable. Between the years 336 and 323 BC, a span of only 13 years, he managed to conquer the entire Persian Empire. He managed, in fact, to conquer pretty much the entire known world. The Persians did try to fight back. In 333 BC, Persian forces met Macedonian ones at the Battle of Issus in Turkey. The Persian army was a lot larger, but it didn't matter. Alexander chased the Persian king Darius III off the battlefield. Darius III was so eager to get out of there that he even left his wife and children behind. In one of his shows of mercy, Alexander the Great made sure that they were somewhere they could live in comfort and safety. King Darius III did try to ransom his wife and children back and strike a truce at the same time. He offered Alexander lands and money in exchange for peace. "If I were you, I would take it," said one of Alexander's generals. "If I were you, so would I," responded Alexander. But Alexander was not that general, and he knew that he had the Persians on the run. Naturally, he said no to Darius's offer. Before engaging the Persians again, however, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great stopped by Tyre. You'll remember Tyre as the Phoenician island city which made so much purple dye that the city was famous for its stench. Alexander the Great didn't seem to find the smell off-putting, however. All he could smell was the potential for conquest. But he had a problem. How do you besiege an island when you don't have a navy? Well, if you need land to besiege a place, better make land. Alexander the Great had his engineers design a land bridge connecting the mainland to the island. Then it was a simple matter to get all his siege engines across the land bridge and surround the city. He besieged Tyre for 7 months, and at the end of it was so annoyed with the citizens for holding out so long that he slaughtered and enslaved every person in the place. That's one of those atrocities I was talking about. Alexander's land bridge was so successful that even today, Tyre is part of the mainland of modern Lebanon. Persian and Macedonian forces clashed again in 333 BC at the Battle of Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq. Although outnumbered 1-5, Alexander chased Darius III off the battlefield again, and the Persian army collapsed. Alexander the Great was now officially the king of all Asia. But why stop there? In 327 BC, Alexander the Great marched his troops to India, where he was victorious against enemy troops and war elephants alike. But with his tired troops on the verge of mutiny, remember, they'd been conquering places for over a decade. They wanted to go home. He headed back to Persia. But Alexander the Great himself would not live to see his home again. In 323 BC, while in Babylon, Alexander the Great fell ill and died. He was only 32 years old. And that's when the troubles really began, because although 2 women were pregnant with Alexander the Great's children, he didn't have an official heir. Legend says he said his empire should go to the strongest. Well, it did. His empire ended up being split between 5 of his top men. Although Alexander the Great's empire died with him, he is still remembered as one of the greatest military commanders and strategists in world history. People in military academies today still study his strategies. Next week, we'll take a look at some of the non-military effects of Alexander's rule when we study the Hellenistic world. See you next week.